Well, many households will be sweating on today's inflation figures because it will dictate what the RBA does next week. Joining me now is the Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume. Jane, thanks so much for your time. Look, inflation still is historically low given where we've seen it in the last couple of years. What are you expecting today and whose fault is it?
Well, whatever we see today, we know that it is going to be fundamentally important, absolutely critical in the RBA's decision-making next week. And you're right, there are plenty of households out there with mortgages that are doing it really tough right now. We're hearing on the ground that a lot of them, this is simply going to push them to breaking point. But what we do know, no matter what the inflation result is today, that it could have been so much lower. It could have been lower had the government used its fiscal firepower, not just relied on the RBA using monetary policy to bring inflation back under control. Particularly that last budget in May, there was hardly an economist in Australia that didn't say that that expansionary budget was inflationary.
What should it have done, Jane? Should it have not given households that energy rebate? Should it have delayed the tax cuts?
Well, certainly there is an argument to say that if you spend less, a very logical argument to say that if you spend less, if you don't expand, if it's not an expansionary budget, well, then you dampen demand, overall demand. Why would you, for instance, in a budget like the one we saw in May, include a $1 billion expenditure on solar panels, for instance? If you scatter money about throughout the economy, whether it be in people's pockets or whether in businesses, if you're driving expansion, if you're fueling expansion, well, of course, you're going to push inflation up higher. And we're seeing that now, not just in the inflation figures that we're expecting today, but in how that they are moving in a completely different direction to our overseas counterpart. Jim Chalmers is terrific at blaming anybody else for this problem. He'll tell you that there are pressures from overseas. But in fact, inflation is coming down and interest rates are coming down in the US, in the UK, in New Zealand, Korea, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, everywhere.
And all those
we are
places
seeing
seem to be losing
inflation
jobs
come down
too.
And interest rates
Is that
come
the
down.
quid pro quo here?
Well, we would hope not. If you can maintain a strong economy, and that is that is
But those
possible,
economies
even when
that you
inflation is
mentioned
coming
haven't
down.
been able to bring inflation down and maintain that job level. That's the point.
Well, it really is the priorities that you're placing on the RBA. I mean, the RBA has one job. It has one job, and that is to bring inflation under control. And if it has to keep raising interest rates further and further in order to do that, well, that actually it's a very, very blunt tool. Now, it's an effective tool, don't get me wrong. It's timely. The moment interest rates go up, demand is dampened. But it's such a blunt tool because it really only hits those sections of society like mortgage holders, landlords pushing up rent. It's a very untargeted way of keeping your inflation under control. Fiscal policy is a way that could have been used in a much more effective way to keep inflation under control so that the RBA doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting.
Well, as you mentioned before, you suggested you wouldn't have spent $1 billion on solar panels, but would that really have brought inflation under control? I note that target ban has not been reached for 10 years.
Neither would we have employed an additional 36,000 public servants. That 36,000 public servants costs billions of dollars to the budget bottom line. It artificially increases your employment numbers. And most importantly, that's taxpayer money that's being used to do that. I'm sure that taxpayers would much rather the money be in their pockets, particularly during a cost of living crisis. If the government wanted to keep inflation under control, there are things it could have done. It chose not to. So whatever it is that we see today, whatever the number is, understand that the government could have done more. It could have been lower. And the RBA's decisions would be that much easier.
All right, just finally, Rex, should a government bailout be on the cards here?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to say that there are a lot of people out there hurting today. And we're not talking about passengers who have been inconvenienced, and certainly that's a big deal. But the employees of Rex really only heard about the fact that their own company is teetering on the edge in the last 48 hours, and there's a lot of families making some, pretty tough decisions themselves right now. On top of that, regional communities rely on REX. I was up in Alice Springs just a few months ago with the Cost of Living Committee, and we were talking to the European school, who was saying that, they actually rely on the regional airlines and the airport in Alice Springs to provide reasonably priced airfares, because otherwise they can't attract the teachers to work in that school. People simply won't come to remote communities or regional communities if they don't feel like that they have access to big cities at a reasonable price.
So there is a case for a government bailout?
The government has failed here. Well, I think the most important thing here is that the government works closely with the executive of REX, with the administrators, with the ACCC, with the regulators, to make sure that there is an outcome that works for everybody. Because what we've seen is Anthony Albanese criticise REX for making a commercial decision to operate on routes where Qantas was operating. Now, fair go. I mean, a company is entitled to make commercial decisions that it thinks is in its interest.
As we sit here now, it wasn't in its interest, it turns out.
Yeah, but this is a government that clearly isn't interested in having competition in the airline industry. We saw that in its decision to block Qatar from getting additional access routes to Australia. I think that they're perhaps barracking for one carrier here, but regional communities need REX. They need REX. They need to have competition in the airline, in our aviation system, and the government should keep that first and foremost in its mind, because our regional communities will simply die a slow and painful death without accessible airlines and at affordable prices.
But you're not quite willing to leap to the government bailout at this point?
Well, we're only 2 days into this process. I would very much hope that Anthony Albanese, rather than admonishing REX, would actually work with them.
OK, does that mean bailout should be on the cards though?
Well, I think Jim Chalmers has already said that nothing's off the table. The most important thing, though, is that they work with the administrators, with the executive and with the ACCC to ensure that there is competition in our airline system and that our airlines are viable.
Jane Hume, always good to talk to you. We'll see you soon.
See you, Laura.